Everybody, welcome to The Way Back, a discussion of the film and TV industry in the COVID-19 era. This series is presented by Green Slate and produced by the Catch a Break podcast. I'm Julie Harris-Walker. I'm the SVP of West Coast Operations at Green Slate and the host for the Catch a Break podcast. Now, today is the third in a series of 4 conversations we're having about working in the age of COVID-19. And today we're talking about what I'm calling the biggest elephant in the room, and that is financing, insurance, and deals. Several states have announced that they are open for business. So why aren't we shooting yet? Our panel today is going to go into the nitty-gritty of what the business behind the business is looking like. Are the old models going to work? What is changing in the new landscape? So I'd like to introduce our panel. Steve Berman serves as the Executive Vice President of Production for Film Finances, the world leader in completion guarantees. On average, Film Finances provides completion guarantees to over 150 film and television projects produced globally each year. Their recent credits include Uncut Gems, Narcos, and John Wick Chapter 3. Steve joined Film Finances in LA in 2000, and as Executive Vice President of Production, he oversees a project's progress from early pre-production through final delivery for distribution, and this includes reviewing each project's viability for success based on the personnel, the budget, the locations, and the schedule. Steve has worked on over 200 feature films shot all over the world. Welcome, Steve.
Hello, thank you.
Liz Jenkins is the CFO of Hello Sunshine, the multimedia company founded by Reese Witherspoon. In that capacity, Liz is tasked with accelerating and enabling the growth of the company's increasingly robust and multifaceted business, which includes their scripted, unscripted, kids and animation studio businesses, audio storytelling, Reese's Book Club, and more, all of which put women and girls at the center of each narrative. Previously, Liz has served as the head of strategic ventures for Sony PlayStation and senior vice president of corporate development and strategy at Media Rights Capital, where she developed and implemented innovative distribution models, strategic partnerships, and new business across film and television. You may recall a little show called House of Cards. I think Harvard Business Review did a whole paper on that particular deal. She began her career in finance at GE and Credit Suisse. Liz has also served on the boards of several nonprofit organizations, including Female Executives in Media Entertainment, the nonprofit organization of which she is the co-founder. She got her MBA from Wharton and her BA from Stanford. Welcome, Liz.
Hi, everyone.
Nicole Papincak is an entertainment transactional attorney who has been working in the industry since 2005 and practicing law since 2011. Prior to joining Reeder and Feig in 2017, she was an associate at a boutique entertainment law firm and represented film distributors, financiers, and production companies with a focus on theatrical business and legal affairs. Nicole also teaches seminars at Film Independent, providing filmmakers with educational information regarding how to navigate pre-production from a legal perspective and successfully effect legal delivery to film distributors. She received her BA in sociology with a minor in government from Smith and her JD from Loyola here in LA. A Pittsburgh native, go Steelers, Nicole is a self-proclaimed a cappella nerd and cycling enthusiast. Welcome, Nicole, and perhaps hum a few bars.
Yeah, hello, everyone.
Adrian Ward is the Senior Director, Market Executive of Banc of California. Adrian has been the head of entertainment banking at Banc of California since 2018, which is ideally positioned to serve the entertainment sector. His career in entertainment banking began in 1991 when he was involved in developing the first ever bank finance production loans and gap finance transaction at the Lewis Horowitz organization. In the late 90s, Adrian returned to London as LHO's European representative, where he specialized in European tax incentive transactions, and then returned to LA to become the portfolio manager for ICB Entertainment Finance, and later SVP of National Bank of California's Entertainment, Sports, and Media Department, funding such titles as My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Monster, The Tudors, The Tempest, Red Dog, and The Ward. Welcome, Adrian.
Hi, Julie.
Brian Kingman. As managing director of Gallagher Entertainment, Brian's job is to help Hollywood find coverage for its stars in their films. That isn't always easy. Some actors, particularly troubled stars or the penchant for brushes with the law, can be difficult to ensure. But Brian has a proven track record of success. During his career, he has provided insurance solutions for numerous Hollywood productions, including several Tyler Perry films and several installments of the Hunger Games series. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you for including me.
Thanks for coming. So as we jump in, this is a panel and a podcast, so we will try to be as conversational as we can in this particular format. If you are inside of the Zoom or you are on Facebook, we're also going to be taking your questions towards the end, so please type them into whichever format you're on, and our team will gather them and send them in to me. Now, I want to tell you in advance, normally this is exactly an hour, but today I think the topic is so dense. We have so much good information. We're probably going to run over, so we've allowed time for that. So consider yourself warned. Okay, here we go. Brian, I'm going to start with you. So starting at the beginning of the COVID crisis, how did the shutdown affect the insurance companies? Let's start there.
Well, as managing director for Gallagher Entertainment, we represent about 40% of the industry. So on the onset of the shutdown, we were responsible for advising about 400 productions worldwide. We got calls from clients, am I covered? What kind of coverage do I have? Do I have enough? So we've been spending most of our time recently just consulting on claims, scoping on claims, and also trying to reboot for the eventual comeback.
I imagine it was a pretty big hit for that first shutdown.
Yes, just to give you the economies of scale in our little boutique entertainment insurance arena, we write about $500 million worth of premiums globally. This one occurrence, which shuttered approximately 1,500 to 2,000 productions, has cost the entertainment insurance industry about $1.5 billion. So what does that mean? That means that 3 years of premiums due to one occurrence, gone, right? So right now, the carriers don't even know if it's going to be $1.5 billion because we don't know what's going to happen when productions then start up again. Because they can be shuttered again. They can expand their claims, and these claims can grow, and their losses can grow. So right now, the insurance companies are paralyzed in the fog, like a lot of people. And until there's clarity, we're not going to see much help from the traditional entertainment markets.
It seems like a big hit, and I imagine they would be reluctant to be diving back in again. So let's just talk about specifically if someone had a policy and they got shut down and they're moving forward, it's my understanding that that policy is still in effect. But then also, what about getting a new policy right now? Is that even possible, or what might that cost? What are we looking at?
The good news is anything that's shut down probably had the right kind of insurance products, and they could be adequately covered. They might be underinsured. We're going on 4 months of a shutdown. Most of the insurance products provide limits for civil authority, imminent peril, for anywhere from $500,000 to maybe $5 million any one claim. So that's where we are. If you were in production and you're going back into production, then you're probably okay if you haven't used up your limit, right? If you did not have insurance before the onset of the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic, then you will have a very difficult time in procuring insurance unless you had some form of blanket insurance program that, again, was procured prior to the outbreak.
So what about, I've heard some talk about some government assistance, maybe something like what happened around 9/11, and different countries around the world are doing different things. What is your take on what's happening as far as a governmental backstop?
Well, that's the hope. The hope is, there's the PRE-Act, there's similar acts in various countries around the world. See, this one occurrence hit the industry so terribly and so tragically, and caused so much damage financially. And just to give you an example, regular businesses don't have what we have, right? They don't have civil authority, they don't have CAS insurance, they don't have imminent peril. They have business interruption insurance that's normally triggered by property damage, right? So the good news is there's a lot of insurance for our industry that other industries don't have. The bad news is it can be really, really hard to get in the future, either come renewal, or if you're an independent filmmaker and you don't have any relationships with insurance companies or anything existing currently.
Okay, so let's shift over to you, Steve, because it feels like it's a waterfall effect. So could you talk to us about, just real quickly, what is a bond? And then talk about how these struggles with insurance is going to affect your ability to bond productions going forward.
Absolutely. So a completion bond, for those who don't know, is a insurance product that is a guarantee to the financiers of the film that the film will be completed on time and on budget. So they're not taking the risk that they'll actually have the film at the end of the day. That becomes our risk. And also we bear any over budget costs to get the film actually completed. So it's really an item to trigger a lot of independent financing. So we do about, as you mentioned in my intro, about 150 projects a year. That is about the number that we had in some phase of production when COVID hit. So all of those films were disrupted. And so we're in the process of trying to get all of those films completed. Going forward to your direct question, so we have our initial problem of how do we complete films, which I could talk about those challenges. But as far as new business, similar to the insurance market, our bond product will now have a COVID exclusion in it, because that is now a risk that's been passed on by the exclusion in insurance onto our liability that we can't take on either. So that's a problem for the financiers that we deal with, for a lot of the producers we deal with. So we're trying to sort that out. The key to sorting that out will be the same solutions that Brian's talking about filling that gap of insurance risk. Because as I said, if that risk is not covered by the insurance market, that then falls to us as the guarantor. So for the time, we have to exclude that as it's our liability, and that very much limits the bonds we can write at the moment.
Because I'm guessing, are you mostly writing bonds for independent productions who may not have the deep pockets to go without insurance?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we actually bond a lot of films with studios, with streamers, but the primary crux of our business, and the reason why bonds even became a product in the 1950s, was to help independent producers who didn't have the resources, had to use bank loans to get collateral from foreign sales, et cetera. So that is the bulk of who we're dealing with, and yet they do not have the resources to backstop this kind of risk.
And then as you're reviewing budgets for these films, are you getting a sense of kind of how COVID is hitting budgets? Are you just raising them by a certain percentage? Have you narrowed that down yet, or what is that looking like?
We definitely haven't narrowed it down. We're getting a viewpoint. Obviously, the paper that was just put out by SAG and the IA, the DGA on Friday finally gave some clarity that everyone was waiting on. There was a lot of assumptions that were already taken into account. From some work that we've seen kind of a general increase in budgets from 10 all the way up to 20%. Obviously, that depends on the specifics of any one movie. And obviously, it's a bigger percentage jump for the smaller budgets, which is the majority of what we do. But prep periods are going to need to be longer. Shooting periods need to be longer. Obviously, there's a whole new set of personnel that need to be on set, PPE costs, excuse me. And testing is the real question mark, because what is the availability of testing? What is the cost associated with that, and how much of it do we need to do? So obviously we got these standards that were put out last Friday, and we're already finding out that in some jurisdictions that level of testing just isn't even logistically feasible. So, what is the workable solution that producers can implement?
I mean, that is the trick. Everyone can agree on what the protocols are, but actually implementing the protocols is an entirely different hurdle that everyone has to figure out. Okay. Adrian, let's switch over to you, because I imagine all of this also changes how you can finance. So what are you seeing on your end?
Yeah, it definitely does, Julie. I mean, as Brian and Steve were talking about, the passing along of that COVID risk, the next stop on that chain is with the financier, and obviously, as a bank, we're not in the business of taking that. So we're turning around sort of full circle to the producer and saying, without any insurance product to be able to, currently cover that, what are the mitigants to overcoming it? I think, the one thing that's been very encouraging is that a lot of the independent producers, who are by nature very creative and very adaptable, have been, coming up with a lot of solutions. And obviously there's been, a lot of talk about it in the industry at every level. But ultimately it is a financial risk. And, for us, we're lending money with an expectation that it's going to be paid back in a certain time frame as one of the the main elements of that. That risk becomes exponentially bigger in terms of what happens if there's another shutdown, what happens if, you have to move from where you are, and, all those sorts of things. So there's not really been a solution other than, talking to producers about potentially them or their company putting up a guarantee behind it. And obviously that's not an appealing option at this point. So, going back to whether there's some sort of government-backed pool, insurance pool, or an insurer at some point, changing their mind and taking that leap. There's not a lot of answers at the moment, but I do think out of all these conversations, there will be, hopefully there'll be something that comes along.
And I'm also wondering how your models are changing. I remember in the crash of 2008, like the $20 million film in particular disappeared during that time because all the models had changed. Since we see distribution changing and theaters may or may not be open, is that changing the models? And do you have a prediction of kind of what budget level we may see more of?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, from all the conversations I've had, I think the consensus is that what will start in terms of, production will generally be smaller budget films. Obviously, theaters are reopening, but again, you have to sort of ask, what are people going to be going to see movies in that element? Studios obviously have deep pockets and they've got alternatives in terms of the way they're going to distribute those movies, and whether they put it out on, on VOD, day and date, or just VOD, like some of the things that they've done in the last 4 months. That seems to be another option that they've looked at. For smaller movies that aren't necessarily, relying on that theatrical element, I think, they're relying on the fact that certainly internationally, there is a desire and a demand for more product. So, we were involved with an animated film that's been in production, this whole time. And so, and we sort of spoke to a lot of the international distributors, and they're clamoring to have a film delivered so that they've got something new to put out there in different sort of, media. So I think people are going to have to be a little bit resourceful and sort of think about, what type of films can they succeed with right now until there's, the world opens up in a bigger way.
I mean, everyone working on animation right now just looks particularly psychic and like they've made the best bet. One more question for you, Adrian. If a lot of your financing model also has the tax incentive, and the tax credit piece of it, that feels to me very unsure right now, considering what's happening financially all over the place. Do you have a perspective on that piece?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, again, in some of the forums that I've been involved in, we've been asking film commissioners in different jurisdictions about the viability of the tax incentives, because obviously, in different cities and states and countries, there's a huge, financial pressure, in their general economic situation. So, so far the reaction that we've had is that, these incentives are very much, still in place. Obviously the longer that this goes on, that may change, but I think, sort of along the lines of what happened in, Louisiana after Katrina, the film incentive down there was instrumental, I think, in some of the rebuilding of that economy, in bringing in, dollars to the, hotels and restaurants and everything like that. So I hope there's an element of that, and I hope that these the incentives can, weather that storm and then still be there to attract, new investment.
Yeah. Okay, Nicole, give us some good news.
Hello.
What are you seeing as far as you're making deals and things going into development, and how is that all shaking out right now?
Yeah, from our perspective, being legal counsel to, production companies, especially, independent producers who are looking for financing and do bond their movies and do, need insurance of all kinds. We are seeing a pivot towards focusing on development and things that can go forward. On the other hand, we have some very innovative clients who are taking advantage of this moment and exploring the idea of remote shooting. And, that has presented its own issues with, the guilds, especially SAG-AFTRA, who of course is quite interested in protecting its employees and the amount of work that they're doing beyond performing, as it were. So we're seeing some interesting challenges with that, but I'm very lucky to be, working with one client in particular who is pushing that envelope and getting things, moving in a way that shows that this can be done. On the other hand, we're seeing other clients focus not only on development, script writing, pivoting away from live action production to motion capture. And as Adrian and Steve mentioned, animation. As you said, Julie, the people who are doing animation projects right now can just keep going. And it's kind of amazing to see, oh wow, a lot of this does happen with a person behind a computer being able to communicate remotely, not necessarily being on set or on location where you're basically creating like a small city that you're moving around wherever you're shooting. So it's been really interesting to see how clients, like I said, are pivoting to focus on what they can. And, it's really interesting from a legal perspective and how we're drafting and negotiating documents now, and how quickly we've had to think about issues like assumption of risk. If you come on set or we're going to be developing something, you choose to take a job and you take the risk, can we ask people to sign a waiver essentially? And, we've kind of analogized it to situations, say you're representing a producer who's doing a docu-series in a third world country, and you ask the crew who's shooting there to sign assumption of risk waivers essentially that say, that you're going to a place that may or may not have running water, first class medical care, etc. And by taking the job, you're an adventurist and you're going on this mission with us. We've done that before, but can that happen with this? We're navigating it all together. So, for us, I feel in this moment very boots on the ground with our producer and production company clients, namely the indie ones, where we're kind of, weathering this together and figuring it out. And when we hit a roadblock one place, we want to be a part of that solution. So yeah, what a magical time we're in.
We are blessed to live in interesting times.
Blessed and highly favored, yeah.
So it sounds like people are certainly figuring out how to make content, but not bringing tons of people back to work, it sounds like. So when you're talking about actors figuring out how to shoot remotely, so that actor is also the camera person, the makeup person, the grip, the lighting, doing all of those different jobs, which then you have to accommodate for, I suppose. And it must bring up a bunch of union issues about cross functions.
Yeah, that's right. So it's interesting from, both sides. I consider myself, with what I do as an entertainment transactional lawyer, it's like I'm on the dark side, negotiating against the talent side. And, we on the dark side know that our clients have budgeted a certain amount for cast that does not include also perhaps compensating for them being their own makeup artist, wardrobe, lighting, director of photography, etc. And whatever savings they're holding from not having a makeup department or not having all of those things that you usually need when everyone is on set or on location, the idea is it's going to go on screen to make this look better. But then we have pushback, and I'm sure that a lot of people in the audience have perhaps seen notices from, SAG specifically. I'm thinking of that at the moment, saying, hey, performers, you have the right to negotiate a higher rate for services that you're doing beyond performing. And again, that is something that, like I said, sort of being boots on the ground with our clients, we see that and we're like, what? And kind of weathering that together and figuring out what that means. And I think it's interesting because, the guilds are in a similar position where everybody's trying to scramble to figure out what the right thing is to do, how to not break rules that aren't clear yet. And that's, very interesting. You kind of have to be on your toes at all times. Every day is, honestly, every single day something new is coming up that we have to kind of be like, okay, what are we doing? Does that involve putting a new provision in the agreement? Do we need a new exhibit? Do we need a new remote training session on how to be careful and social distance and et cetera? So.
You all have to just be on your game. And I'm
Yeah.
also thinking, hearing all this, it's not like suddenly everyone has a ton of more money, right? It's not like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's crazy. Okay, Liz, you have a whole slate of things across a whole bunch of different genres. So how is this affecting you and what you guys are focusing on and prioritizing to get into production?
I mean, first I'll say thank goodness we are in the animation business, as has been echoed by a lot of other people on this panel thus far. It's interesting because I think when most people think of Hello Sunshine, they think of big, scripted series like Big Little Lies, Morning Show, Little Fires Everywhere, et cetera. And that was where our business started. But then I'd say probably starting early last year, we really made the decision intentionally to form 2 other studio businesses. So we have our scripted film and television studio, an unscripted TV and film studio, and we've got kids and animation. And so we haven't announced the show yet, so I won't spoil it, but we're heading into production on our first animated series. And, I have to be honest and say it wasn't out of a let's diversify, like my business mind saying we need to be at each of these sorts of verticals, but it was really about, for us, it all centered around our mission, which was, changing the narrative for women through storytelling. And it starts with changing the narrative for girls. So that's why we launched a kids and animation business. So it is, fortunate, it's a happy circumstance that we are, we have all of those different types of projects that we are working on because they have all been disrupted to different degrees. For example, Morning Show season 2, we were in the early days of, shooting. I think we were like 1 to 2 weeks in. And so I know Brian has been working with our partners over at MediaRes on figuring out the plan to get that back up and running. But then on the other end of the spectrum, like I mentioned with animation, it has been, kind of full speed ahead. And so as I think about it in my kind of finance terms, I compare things versus budget, no change versus the 2020 budget as we looked at like animation. Unscripted, it's been interesting because it kind of falls somewhere in between. There are certain projects where, one project that we are in development and on right now, it had been originally conceived as like, this is global. It was very central to the creative of the show, et cetera. And so we're doing, I think that's still a possibility done in an ingenious way, perhaps. So we're looking at 2 different models, or like there's a kind of COVID A, COVID B plan. Like here's the global version, here's the US version. And then, we've actually are starting production on 2 other unscripted projects where there are, fortunately, it's a fairly long schedule. They lend themselves to like a lot of archival like footage. And so you think, okay, well, hopefully we can get that work done up front and then either A, be in a position to do kind of interviews and other things as, originally conceived of in person on a set, or we start thinking about doing it on a remote basis and are already working with, different partners on how would we set that sort of thing up. So that was kind of, as I thought, like our current pipeline and how do we manage. So there's a lot of that, but then there's the conversation of, how does this change like the type of content that we're developing, right? How do we, because there is more than ever a need for content. And so how do we meet that need? I think it's out of any sort of chaos comes an interesting opportunity. But, we are very mindful of the challenges around insurance, around like, risk, both kind of financial risk, reputational risk. That's something we're all concerned about. I think every person on this call or in this business, you don't want to be a part of, anything where there's any sort of jeopardy attached to folks who are showing up to work with you around any of your partners. So we're super mindful of that and, appreciative. I think the one thing I'll say that has been so wonderful throughout this challenging time is just the collaboration you continue to see like across like this industry. I've had multiple phone calls with Mr. Kingman, who's been very helpful to our company as we, are thinking through, how do we move forward through this? And similarly with a lot of our banking partners, our legal counsel, et cetera. So
yeah, it's a really small world. That world, I'm rarely on a call where all the people don't already know each other at all the different companies. I would like you to really focus on figuring out Morning Show because I'm waiting for season 2 actively right now. I also wanted to ask you if you could tell us, how is this change? Are you having to go back and revisit your deals and your your distribution deals and things like that, if you can talk about it?
I mean, I think what's interesting is I'd say there's always a fear. I'll tell you, like in circumstances like this, and I think it happened during the writer's strike, right? Years ago, that partners will, invoke a force majeure and or try to change terms, et cetera. And I think that, we have, I think we're very fortunate. The partners and platforms that we're in business with continue to be very excited, as excited as you are about Morning Show Season 2 and others, so I think it's really, I've found that also to be a huge collaboration, and even I was laughing, we were working on a budget for a new show with one partner. And, the number of times we kept coming back and saying, okay, well, this I think is the number now because of COVID, but we're not, and everyone, it's like, we get it. We're all trying to figure this thing out without a lot of visibility. And there will be an element of trial and error, and so I think that I found it to be really gratifying. And that's been most of the kind of the theme of the conversation has really been about like, how do we make this like work on a timeline there's been flexibility around timelines, all of that, versus it people feeling like people are trying to reopen deals and retrade certain points. It's really about how do we do this in a way that's like safe for everybody involved and gets it done as soon as we can.
I mean, it's a real exercise for all of us to be in the moment, because if you get too attached to any plan, tomorrow everything has changed again. So I do want to ask you, in the budgets, I imagine you're having now a COVID line with a lot of detail about how you deal with that. Are you also making your contingencies bigger then for the unknown?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have, I think there's some of the various lines that have been impacted. Obviously, insurance, as Brian referenced, I'll tell you, we probably are setting aside 2 to 3 times what we used to set aside for insurance. Specifically, there are things around like PP&E. There are things like, we've got an onset COVID coordinator and testing. And then down to kind of, if you think about transpo, how many people can be in a car at once? Does every single person have to have a car? And then there's, we have, again, I think we haven't broken out yet a specific COVID contingency line, because I feel like at this point we're still very much in a back and forth with our partners as increased information is coming out. And I think we're looking at it both. So we think about our policies and practices that we're putting into place. We've got one this is the Hello Sunshine, COVID safety policies and procedures, as well as things that we're developing for each of our series in particular. And I'll tell you, those have been changed as there's increasing information given they're in different jurisdictions, et cetera. So it's very much not actually a moving target. It's just an evolving target. So it's by no means like anything that we're trying to have false precision around, like this is the actual number. Well,
Steve wants to jump in on that.
Well, yeah, a little bit. And I wanted to piggyback off something you said, just in terms of, that these budgets are already sort of stretched thin for independents. And so where is all this money going to come from? Not to open up an older issue, but, independent films are always backing into a number. Especially in the last few years, the streamer market has really changed the foreign sales market, which is the backbone of financing for independent films. So they're trying to hit a real narrow strip. So now you add all these COVID realities to it. And, in a lot of original intentions with these budgets and production plans, it's just not tenable. So there's pressure on a budget side that needs to be figured out. So that needs to change going forward, but also on the idea that I think Liz was talking about is just flexibility. And that also pertains to legal obligations. So as far as, we're always being boxed in with, you can only have an actor for this many days, or they have a very tough hard out stop date, or you have to deliver the film by this date, which doesn't allow for any force majeure events or just creative, taking longer to get the film where you want it to be. And we as the guarantor are often seeing producers and ourselves put in these very tight boxes. And that's just not workable in a COVID environment, because we need flexibility to solve problems. Kind of what we're saying is, look, we don't mind taking on problems and working with producers to solve them, but we need some runway to do that. So if we can't, move dates, if there's a cost to it, we can account for that. But if the limitations are so strict that if anything goes wrong, the whole thing collapses, that doesn't work. So that's gonna be relevant with vendor deals, with cast deals, with crew deals, with distribution agreements. All of those things are gonna have to account for this.
Okay. Let's go to some questions from the audience. And Steve, we're going to stay on you. The first one is for you. So the next stimulus package may eliminate a company's liability if a COVID issue stops or affects production. How is your group affected by that?
I have to be honest, I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think there is some talk of companies not being liable if people come to work and get COVID. Although, as I'm reading that may become a workers' comp issue more than a liability issue. So let's all think about that, and we'll move down the list here. Here's a bunch of questions for Nicole. Do you envision unions allowing talent or crew to solely elect to sign producer liability waivers?
No, I think it's going to be an issue. And I imagine, and I know I said before, we've been having these conversations about assumption of risk and waivers and things like that. But honestly, we can try, but I think it's going to cause a really big issue. And, I don't think it's a matter of, enforceability from a legal perspective. But I think in terms of if you have a union production and you're asking all of your, union and above the line guild members to sign something, and those unions and guilds come together and say, no, you cannot force our members to sign something like that, or even not forced. They're not enforceable to us under the collective bargaining agreement. If you're a signatory, just throw it in the garbage. Now if you have a non-union show project, we'll see. But I imagine that it's going to be an issue. So,
yeah, and then are we also kind of waiting to see if they're tested in court?
Possibly. One of the things about the collective bargaining agreements is any sort of disputes that arise go into, guild mandated arbitration. And so it's one of those things where, something could be going on that perhaps we don't know about. It's, it may or may not be something that becomes, subject to the trades. But I think if they all come out with a position and say, hey, members, do not sign waivers, we're going to know about it. And it's not, and it perhaps isn't going to be something that people are even going to try to do on union shows, because it's just going to cause a headache. And, a lot of time, especially with independent producers, you're up against a Goliath. And that is certainly not limited to this issue. That's a lot of things when you become a signatory, so.
Okay, Brian, a lot of questions about insurance. So you said that it was difficult to obtain insurance for new projects. Does that mean that COVID will not be covered, or that you won't be able to get insurance at all? Can you get insurance but carve out COVID? What might that look like?
I think some of both. The insurance rates are going way up, in some cases double, triple. Some of the sublimits for imminent peril, civil authority, some of these enhanced coverages that we came up with after the riots in LA in 1992 and Katrina in 94, and other events. These were enhancements to the standard extra expense coverage parts. Carriers are looking at any one occurrence that could affect many productions on many different policies. We call that a concentration of risk. And so carriers are gonna be very careful how they deal with concentration of risk. And yes, absolutely, they are excluding COVID-19, pandemics, communicable disease, and they're being more selective, because this marketplace, and Steve hit on it a little bit as well. But I always say, look, you can always go to Lloyd's of London and you can stack up enough money and somebody will take it in Lloyd's. And so what's happened is not only the entertainment, film, and television businesses, but the live event business also has specialty products. So when you're talking about the Olympics, you're talking about PGA events, you're talking about Wimbledon, you're talking about every pop and rock concert around the world. The London market has reserved in the billions on those lines, and it's like banking or syndicating a big bank loan in the insurance business. You have primary insurers, and then you have reinsurers, right? So all the primary carriers rely on reinsurance. So when the reinsurance market says, "Hey, we're not providing any COVID-19 insurance, period," then they can't take that risk as a net line company. So their only answer is to follow suit and exclude that risk moving forward. Now the streamers, which are in some cases worth over $1 trillion in market capitalization, they don't really need insurance. They like insurance when it makes sense, and they need compliance products, but they're so big, and most of the major studios as well are so big, they're going to move on. They're going to make their content. The real area that we need to help out in, and that's where I'm focusing a lot of time, and that's the pure independent producer, because they are so reliant on insurance. They can't afford a 2 to 3 week shutdown that's not insured. Steve's going to make them put another 10% in the contingency if you'd even go that far. And Adrian's saying, "Hey, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that, unless Steve takes the risk." And Steve says, "I'm not comfortable with it unless Brian takes the risk." So both insurance costs are going up. The market we've been in the longest, softest insurance marketplace in the history of the business. So it was correcting itself already in certain areas, right? But it's a numbers game. So the I guess the light at the end of the tunnel is that we need the studios and other filmmakers to go out there and blaze a trail, do it in a smart way, get a track record where they don't have these shutdowns, where they don't have the problems. New capital is going to come into the business, new insurance companies, new money, right, that aren't trailing, maybe a potential, another maybe $750 million in potential liability for a potential stoppage again on any film or set of films or around the world. So I think the upside is I think there's going to be opportunists, there's going to be entrepreneurial financiers that are going to put money back into this business. I just think it might take a while, and then obviously we have until that reinsurance pool either by the federal government, which the one that's proposed doesn't only apply to film, it applies to all businesses. And I'm not sure all the insurance companies will sign on because it doesn't make perfect sense for every insurer. So I'm getting a little wonky here, but that could take a long time and might not work at all. So I'm hopeful that we'll get new carriers that will eventually probably overcharge. And then over time, as more competition comes into the market, then those rates will become more affordable. But as Steve was saying, the margin for some of these independent productions is just not there to shoulder the cost. So I'm fearful that some movies just won't get made.
Yeah, so it seems like there may be some hope for the future, but certainly it's not happening on Monday.
No.
So Steve, here's an interesting question. Do you think the unions are going, and here speak for the unions, are going to allow COVID costs to be outside of the main budget so it doesn't jump a tier just due to COVID costs?
That's a great question. It's one that we've talked about internally. I've talked with a lot of independent producers, and I certainly think they should. We have not engaged in that dialogue directly with the IA, and I don't think any of our productions have gotten feedback on that. I mean, I would argue vehemently that they should. I know that the low budget IA agreement, they just issued a new 3-year contract. So this would be something that would have to be added to the side letter of what you can exclude in the budget definition. I mean, to me, it's clear that this is not a production cost that's going on screen. This is exactly to keep their members safe. So I think it's a very one-sided argument. And all I could say is I think they would be in a very tough spot to argue against that. Yeah, but producers, as they relaunch, are going to have to negotiate that themselves. But we definitely would support that argument.
Yeah, it seems like a good one. Okay, Nicole, how do we incorporate mandatory quarantine periods for cast and crew into deals, I guess?
Oh, man. I mean, I think that's going to come down to set rules. In terms of, and that's actually a really interesting question and something that we've sort of been rolling around. But, I think when, people are issuing set rules to their productions, just depending on, what's happening, I think that's going to be a part of that. Personally, on things that are going forward right now, we're recommending that like basically for every contract, whatever set rules you come up with, whatever they're based on, what the guilds are issuing, what the government is issuing, you slap it on as an exhibit to your agreement. Every single person has to read it. To me, that type of quarantine requirement, if you test positive or you become ill and you're awaiting a negative test or a positive test, I think that's where it would live in terms of how to incorporate it into a contract. Now, to me, as is most things when you're negotiating anything, but also just, in this business or in any business, communication is key. And communicating expectations for people that if you're sick, don't come to work, call out, wear your mask, use your brain, things like that. But again, in writing, those are things that all producers need to think about. Google the crap out of it, ask your friends. More language is better than less language, but make it understandable and make the rules clear and concise. And again, that is not, it becomes a legal issue if it's violated and you get into a liability risk management situation. But think about what's easy to understand, put it in writing, make sure everybody reads it, and sign something that said that they acknowledge it, they understand it, they've received it, thank you very much, amen, goodbye. So there's no confusion about, well, I didn't know about that. That's really what you want to prevent. So get it signed, slap it onto the agreement, make sure everybody, when they're signing that agreement, they're signing off on the fact that they acknowledge and agree to the set rules, including, to get back to the original question, quarantine requirements.
Yeah, everyone has to get on board. And it seems like we're going to be forced into a cultural shift of just what you said, stop coming to work sick. I mean, that should have happened years ago, because then it's also irritating to get everybody's cold. But now it's really vital.
Absolutely.
We have a bunch of questions about COVID safety officers, so I'm just going to let whoever jump in. Here's an interesting question. How do you manage conflicts of interest with COVID safety officers who are paid by the productions? Should it be a third party? And how will OSHA play into this? Does anyone on this panel have a perspective on that? Everyone just kind of making a face. Okay. Then we'll talk about that. Hopefully,
I would say I don't necessarily see a conflict there. You've got an alignment of interests. I mean, everybody wants a safe and virus-free set. I don't know that there is a conflict, but maybe I don't understand the question.
No, that makes sense.
I mean, I tend to I agree with Brian. I guess it's kind of like, if you say if we use an NFL analogy, it's like the independent person who checks to see if you've got a concussion, but I tend to agree with Brian from like our perspective. I wouldn't see it at all as, as a conflict of interest, but understand, obviously there's sensitivities around different pieces around like the testing, who's performing the testing and temperature checks and all of that. I don't have, it's one of those things that I think is evolving as we think through how to address it. But it's, it's a great point, worth considering.
Okay, here's another one. If we bring cast and crew on a non-work day for testing, are we going to need to pay them for that day?
I can guarantee that the union will demand that you do. Yeah. I don't think there's any way around that.
Yeah, I second that emotion for sure.
Yeah, that sounds right. Here's a question actually from last week that we pulled into this week is how can safe set concepts be adapted for the ultra low budget productions? If it's people who are looking to break in, doing really low budget productions, who can't afford all the protocols that have been suggested, how do you think they tweak to still make it safe and be able to get on with production?
It's a good question. It's one I was discussing with a producer earlier this week. I mean, we have to define low budget. I mean, they have a bit of an advantage because their footprint is generally so small anyway. So really it's about I don't know how much they can implement zone A's and zone B's. The problem I have is if they're shooting locations, whether going ahead and sanitizing and doing the kind of pre-work to production, that would be a challenge. And also just the affordability of testing. Obviously, the cost of a test doesn't really change. If anything, it's probably more expensive if you're not paying by volume. But there's such a small footprint, I would think they would figure out a way to do it. But are we talking about under $500,000, under $1 million? It really depends how many people we're talking about. I would hope that all the guilds, as they make concessions for those kind of tier zero micro budget agreements, would make similar concessions when it comes to these protocols.
And then I just think if you have 20 people and you're in LA, do you send everyone down to Dodger Stadium to do the drive-through testing a week before they go on set and take that as their certification if you can't get them? I'm also wondering about, as this pandemic spikes and ebbs and flows around the world, how much you think productions are going to be chasing that around the world? Like, oh, New Zealand is good now, let's all go to New Zealand if they'll let us in. How much of that are you seeing?
I think there's going to be a lot of that. Yeah, I mean, some of the producers that we've been in touch with are already, looking much further afield. You mentioned New Zealand or Australia and some places in Europe are back up and running. But the issue is, how easy is it to get people into those countries? I mean, there's still, travel restrictions, but it seems like some of those countries are obviously quite a ways ahead of where we're at here. And I think the time for, and there'd been a move to that anyway, in terms of exploring, international co-productions and things like that, just from a financial point of view, because often you can net more money to the budget in terms of tax incentives and grant money and state money and things like that, if you're smart about it. So I think that's just going to continue.
I will say, and I'm just relaying what I hear in my conversations with producers about new projects, is that most people are looking to shoot internationally because of the labor requirements. Obviously, there's tax credits abroad. There's there's favorable exchange rates, et cetera. But unfortunately, in the States, just in terms of how far the dollar will get you, for a lot of these independent productions, it makes more sense to go international. And I mean, that's always been a bit of a trend, but in everybody that we're talking to now, they just think it's a path of less resistance. And obviously a place where they can actually make the movie for the number that they have.
Yeah,
I agree with both of those comments. And it becomes part of the calculation, and it also could play into insurance as well. And is it going to cost more to go into certain hotspots? And I've already received questions such as that and others. So it becomes part of the calculation. You assess the risk where you're going. Is it going to impact insurance, travel, all those things that were discussed? Absolutely.
Okay, the next question here regarding the new recommended 10-hour day. Do we think this will be a continuous day? And if so, do we try to negotiate a different meal penalty deal to mitigate that additional cost? Does anyone have perspective on that? We're getting into the nitty-gritty now.
Well, so I could just speak from my experience. It actually seemed to be a growing trend before COVID. More and more of our productions were kind of doing a continuous 10-hour days. It was very rare that they would get the unanimous vote you need to work, French hours or Pacific Northwest hours and not pay the meal penalties. But ultimately, they found out that it was still to their advantage to do it. I don't know if the IA, will negotiate something. I think they should, if they're advocating that that's a safer environment for the members and everybody involved. I would hope there'd be some concession there. So a lot of the films that plan to do continuous days, they did try to offer a meal break where it was feasible. And I do think that some of it is just a mental adjustment. A lot of people found that if we just mentally say we're going to do this in 10 hours, they were able to do the same amount of work virtually in 10 hours. It's really about, well, if we're going to do this over 12 hours, we work at a pace that allows for that. And if we just go in saying it's a 10-hour day, we can do it. Especially if we're eliminating, company moves on the day, a lot of things that are just not going to be practical, and all the protocols are advising against. If we're more of a contained one-day shoot, I think 10 hours is not that much of a disruption.
Okay, here's a follow-up question regarding paying the actors for testing. Do you think we'd be able to combine a testing day with another prep day? For example, go in for your fitting and your test. Or does that defeat the purpose of testing someone before they show up at work?
That's a good question. I guess it's a question for the, well, you're thinking of the zone mentality. That would then put them into a zone prior to getting a test result, so you couldn't do that. You know, something kind of akin to that, it's not the specific question, but in terms of how does everybody adjust, and Liz, maybe you could speak to this on any productions that you guys are looking into, but you know, a lot of producers we're talking about are kind of talking about doing a more beefed up initial shoot day, maybe a very small shoot day or big test day as kind of a test run for these protocols, because it is going to be a new system for everybody. And I think everybody needs to build a little, I mean, there was an article yesterday about the soap opera that did a day of work and then shut down again so they could adjust. And I think that's you know, something that people should really plan for in their production plans, because if you just kind of rush in thinking you're going to know how it's figured, you're going to, you know, it might blow up in your face a little bit.
Yeah, no, we've had lots of similar conversations around that, because I think, you know, again, not to repeat myself, but this is all evolving as we're getting, you know, increased visibility and kind of increased clarity around certain standards that we want to have and what it looks like to actually implement those. So that is something that we've been talking about as well.
Yeah, it makes sense that we would go out and try according to these guidelines, and then you'd have to adjust because things are going to happen on the day, as they always do. Okay, more questions for Brian. You touched on this a little bit, but do you have what is the latest news on a PRPP or a BCPP legislation? Maybe you could explain what those are first.
The PREA Act, which is a federal sponsored program, and it's got to go through Congress. So it's got to pass the House, the Senate, be signed off on by the president. But it's about $750 billion. But it's for all businesses, right? And what it is, it's a reinsurance pool, and it's backed by the federal government. And it gets very complex, but it's in its very early stages. So it's really, I don't know how it's going to end out or whether or not it's even going to get passed. But it's going to take a long time, and it needs the buy-in from all the various insurance companies. And the insurance companies have to commit to providing certain insurance products, not unlike the TRIA Act, right? So that's after 9/11, but all businesses had property insurance, or most, right? So when the 9/11 event happened, it impacted a lot of different insurance policies because they started excluding acts of terrorism right after 9/11 and all the policies that would come up. And so unlike this event, this really only affects certain kinds of policies, those specialty products. But it is starting to hamper, and it will start to hamper businesses and commerce, right, in the future. So what the community wants, and what the citizens want, business operators want, is an insurance product that they never had before, and that's really pandemic insurance, and that's what this bill is all about. So in the event that another pandemic happened and shuttered restaurants, as an example, they would be covered under their business income or business interruption policies. We have these products now. They're virtually been taken away from us. So that's our problem right now. So I hope that it goes through, right? But it will be a safety net that will take some time. And then the carriers will charge a certain amount of premium, just like a box you checked, and it might be 10% of your premium will go into a pandemic insurance bucket. Some of that money will be ceded off to the federal government, but the federal government will be the ultimate backstop, much like terrorism insurance. So that's how that works. There's also there's government programs being launched, still early stages in Canada, as well as the UK and elsewhere around the world. Because they know there's going to be a problem. All the filmmakers are screaming. The bond companies want solutions. The banks are hesitant to loan. It's a real crisis. It will be for independent filmmakers that just only have a certain amount of money to make product. So we're hopeful that these things will come to fruition, but it's going to take some time.
Okay. Now, if a crew person actually tests positive and is sent home to quarantine, who pays them? The production company, workers' comp, state disability, or if they don't have a guarantee, do they just go home and not get paid?
Well, from an insurance perspective, that would be if it's work related, and certain states have already said that there's a presumption that if you do get COVID-19, there's a presumption that it's work related. So I don't know how you escape paying work comp benefits. So work comp covers a very small amount of indemnity, that's lost wages, as well as medical bills. So, my understanding, by the way, I tested positive the IgG test, so I had it, I guess, at some time already. But there's really nothing you can do unless you're hospitalized. So the medical isn't a huge benefit anyway. It would be if you got really seriously ill and didn't make it, and that would be, a big problem. But from a comp standpoint, the benefits are great. I don't see that as a big issue necessarily. I mean, some of the payroll companies might, but I don't see that as a big issue. I do see the potential liability for non-employees contracting COVID-19, and Nicole mentioned that a little bit, and so that's a potential big liability if there's big lawsuits for contracting COVID-19. So that's basically where and by the way, back on the waivers, I don't believe any state allows you to waive workers' compensation benefits. So there's really no way around that. But again, I don't see that as a problem. I see it more as a potential third-party liability issue.
So Liz and Nicole, are you finding that actors are less willing to get on a plane to travel, and how can you make them comfortable? Or are you finding that productions are moving so that they can be local for their stars?
I mean, for us, a lot of our stuff is actually local. And, we think about it both from the standpoint of our actors as well as from like Hello Sunshine employees, and I think to date, like I think of this as being, it's a really personal sort of thing, and everyone has different degrees of comfort doing different things, even down to going to the grocery store. And, I think that the thing that we've kind of to date been able to say and do is that literally if someone doesn't feel comfortable, we're not going to force someone to do it, and I mean, I think obviously you flash forward a few months and there may be different decisions that need to be made or different discussions that are happening. But I think at this point it's, we've been able to really, there hasn't been such a critical decision that would be a sort of go, no go on a project, that we haven't been able to find an alternative or present an alternative to manage, remotely if need be.
Great, Nicole.
Yeah, and I'm finding a couple of things again, as everyone has said so far, and especially Liz, to use your term, like everything's evolving. None of the productions that I was working on that shut down in March are back up, and they may or may not come back up. I mean, you think about, and I think actually all of them were local at the time. Right now, ones that are doing remote shooting are local. Or if they're performers, they can technically do it from wherever they are because they're filming themselves from their bedroom, or wherever they're doing it. But as we were talking about earlier, as Adrian was saying, we are seeing clients who want to get up and running by the end of the year, looking internationally to more remote, like less densely populated areas. And I'm actually negotiating a deal that's probably, that's hoping to actually shoot in early 2021, and there's already a negotiation that says if the actor is not comfortable traveling to a European location, they'll green screen her in New York so she doesn't travel. Because, as Liz was saying, I don't know that it's a make or break the project situation, but they want to accommodate her, so they will. And they're saying, okay, we can green screen this. We'll save the money by not traveling to Europe so we can put that on screen in the green screen. And we're having all these conversations that, haven't really come up that often, like really like green screening versus having someone travel to shoot. with your co-stars. You know, so it's very interesting. So I think I'm hearing all the conversations, but I think we're going to see decisions being made and more trends and patterns like in the next 6 months. You know, right now I feel like every decision's unique. You know, it's because not everybody is on the same path forward. And obviously this is just my experience in my practice with our clients, of course, you know.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's like in this moment, without one, a lot of clarity, two, it's not as if everything is kind of going, and it's down to this one sort of thing. I think that we are fortunately in a place where we can be really intentional about every decision and think about, like, are there different, can you fly, like, even if it's a show with a pretty large crew and cast and you've got to do something international, can you like charter a plane and fly a small crew and like a part of the cast and do, I mean, it's like everything, those are the types of things that you're scenario planning. But I guess in all of this, it's like playing chess and you can't see even like the thing in front, you can't see the relic in front of you. You know, so I think the best you can do, I was joking with someone the other day, they're like, I feel like I'm just being really reactive all the time. I'm like, that's the environment that we're living in. Like when you have no visibility, you're responding. It's not reactive. It's like you're responding as soon as you have enough information to make a better decision or an informed decision. And in the interim, all you can do is look at and assess like a range of options, whether it's green screening someone, flying like a skeleton crew to do one thing, or just, you know, we're going to shoot it like, it's not going to look like Italy, but we're going to shoot it like, you know, in, you know, fill in the blank place. And so, you know, a lot's on the table. And I do think that there has been a great deal of understanding and collaboration across like all the kind of key constituents and players in the industry. I mean, this is not a challenge that one party or one segment of the industry is facing uniquely. It's something that we're all trying to address together and all understand kind of the serious nature of what it is that and personal nature of what it is that we're dealing with.
Yeah, it's like problem solving is the most important skill, and the new education model, which is all group projects and collaboration, is really coming into clear focus. That was a good idea in retrospect. Here's a very specific question. Has anyone kind of had guidelines around at what point does a production need to shut down? Like, are you shut down if you have one case? Or are there mitigation plans? Is there a certain number of cases after which you shut down? What's the plan?
Well, just speaking from my perspective, it's a great question and a question we keep asking. We don't have a definitive answer on it at all. There definitely doesn't seem to be any indication that you need to shut down based on one case. But this becomes a question ultimately, that insurance will need to take a view on. If your permit gets pulled or, stay-at-home orders, the things that we've all just experienced go into place, you don't have a choice. But if it's left to the choice of the producers, ultimately that's going to fall to, at least if you're in the guidance of one of the unions, the HSS is ultimately the person who makes that determination. And I can't imagine any producer advocating for a shutdown if that person isn't saying that it's necessary. So it is interesting to see how that is going to play out. Certainly if a cast member gets ill and they're required to shoot, then that would necessitate some type of shutdown.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to talk a little bit about the insurance side, we're taking the position because we were faced with a lot of those situations early on where there was no government saying, hey, you got to cease and desist, we're pulling your permit, you got stay-at-home orders. We're taking the position, and I'm a broker advocate for the producer, that was what we call an imminent peril, and you just use your best judgment. And so there were a lot of actors and a lot of crew that they were fearful. And they said, hey, it's dangerous. I don't feel comfortable. We don't know enough about this virus. And I don't want to die. I mean, they were literally saying that. So the producers and the studios are basically saying, what do we do? So we took the position that do it, you got to do it, shut it down. And hopefully we can convince the insurance company into paying for it. But there were refusals to work. And so how do you do it if 3 or 4 people say, listen, I'm not prepared to do it. I'm not comfortable with this. And then what kind of a performance do you get out of actors if they're scared to death? So it's a tough one. It's a real tough one.
Yeah. Okay, we're just gonna take a couple more questions and then we'll start wrapping it up. Does the panel feel like the larger studios are waiting for other studios to maybe go first and see how it goes before jumping in? Are we kind of at a waiting game, see who's gonna go?
I think,
To
yeah.
some degree,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Go ahead, Liz.
I mean, I think no one wants to be the first. Like, I'm just gonna say it, like, honestly. But look, I don't think it's also it's an oversimplification to say that everybody's waiting if no one wants to be there first. We have shows in a lot of different platforms that are typically part of larger studios. And I think everyone's doing a lot of the same work. We'll see how everything kind of unfolds over the coming weeks. And for those projects that are, whether it's like The Bold and the Beautiful, or other shows that are starting to get up and running, we'll see kind of how all of that goes. And I'm sure there'll be more folks jumping into the fray as well.
Okay, so I think that brings us to our martini shot, which you guys all know is our last shot of the day. So I got to tell you, like, all of this makes me feel like, so our last question today is going to be, what gives you hope? Leave us with something. I'm just going to go down the line. Brian, do you want to start?
Well, as I said earlier, what gives me hope is that this industry is extremely creative and resourceful. And in the business community, there are risk takers out there. And I think the key is there are productions right now in production. We will learn a lot from those productions. The studios that don't necessarily rely on insurance, or the streamers, they're going to go in at some point, whether they're first or second or third, we'll see. And we'll learn a lot from that as well. And then once we build a track record, right, because insurers in my industry likes to see numbers. They like to see data. They're data driven. Right now, they've never seen anything like this pandemic. So the hope is that we learn a lot over the next 6 months, and who knows, we could have a vaccine, we could have therapeutics, we could have this whole thing. I mean, could doubtful. Nobody's saying this, but it could be in the past at some point. And so maybe it's just temporary, maybe not. I'm an optimist. So the hope is the insurance community, new capital comes in, they establish data, they're able to underwrite it. And then alongside that, maybe the federal government jumps in, agrees to be the ultimate backstop, just like we had a construction crisis at 9/11. Post 9/11, you couldn't get insurance for terrorism. Government helped us out, and therefore buildings started to get jump started, and it's all a big kind of a domino thing. So the hope is that this is short-lived, and people will step up, and I'm not giving up on the independent producers, because they do need the insurance the most, and that's where I'm focusing most of my effort right now, trying to find insurance products at affordable rates that at least keep the business moving forward.
Great. How about you, Nicole?
To me, I think, no matter what position you hold in the entertainment industry, I think the important thing to focus on is entertainment. And the underlying current of that is creativity and resilience and, pivoting and changing the story to fit the moment. And I really believe that, we'll come out of this with perhaps some extremely interesting content that hopefully I'll be lucky enough to, be a part of that backbone. And so, I'm just forever impressed by how, again, I speak for the firm that I work for and the clients that I represent and service. It's just been really awesome to watch people, be able to change paths quickly. And obviously not everyone is that fortunate. Not every single client has that budget or the funding or the money to do it. But at the same thing, I think in the long run, hopefully out of the chaos will come, some new form of creativity that will make us all the better for it. So that's tenacity of the human spirit, moving it forward.
I love it. Steve, it's your turn.
Well, the thing that always gives me hope, and I've had to remind myself, is there's been so many disruption events in the history of film entertainment in general. And usually those are innovations of technology, distribution models, et cetera. And the industry always shifts and moves on. The product is always needed. Producers are always going to produce. Content is always needed. So it's a disruption, and there's going to be people who are very much disrupted in the short term. But I have no doubt that the industry will move forward. This is a speed bump. It's a very painful speed bump, but the industry is needed. It will continue, and it will adjust. And I've seen it in the 20 years that I've been doing it at the bond company. And every time somebody says there's some death knell coming, we pivot, and there's a new market.
Great. Adrian.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think the, and what I'd add is I think there's still great global demand for content, as we're probably going to see with the virtual markets that are coming up. There's a lot of anticipation going into those. I think you'll see some different films getting made that are able to, deal with some of the logistics of this. And producers are going to look internationally to go shoot in places where there's less exposure, and hopefully there will be some ability in the on the financial side to work around some of those issues in terms of the insurance. So but I do believe that the sea change will come when there's a vaccine available, and I think a lot of that risk will go away, and so the more traditional insurance companies and lenders will feel a lot better that you can better manage that risk.
Great. Liz, you get to be the final ray of hello sunshine.
Well, I don't want to repeat what everyone else has said, which is kind of the number one thing as well that gives me hope. Is just like we are an industry full of extremely creative, resilient, ingenious people. And I have absolutely no doubt of, our ability to innovate and create content in new and interesting ways. And, I think the thing that gives me the most hope in this all is kind of something I was referencing before, is we're all in this together. And I think that this has been a moment where you see continued collaboration, openness. I mean, the number of things that people are just sending where normally you'd be like, well, I don't want to send you this deck that I worked on that talks about our approach to this, but it's like people are freely sharing information and best practices and et cetera. That gives me a ton of hope, and it's really affirming to know that we're in this business that's highly collaborative at its core, but to see that really show up in a way that's even more human than I think we've seen. And so I have great faith that we will, we're going to weather this disruption and arguably come out the better for it.
I love all of that. And the thing that gives me hope is there are so many just brilliant people like all of you who are figuring it out. Eventually, I think we're all going to be fine. So that's where we're going to end it for today. I want to thank all of our panelists, Steve Berman, Brian Kingman, Liz Jenkins, Nicole Papincak, and Adrian Ward. And thank you to GreenSlate for being the presenting sponsor of this series. You can find GreenSlate at gslate.com, and also Catch a Break Podcast for producing it. And you can find us at catchabreakpodcast.com. You can subscribe there or on all the podcast places. You can see the replay of this on Facebook or on YouTube. And next week, we're going to be circling back to what types of productions will put their toe in first with our contributors Matt Miller of Vanishing Angle, Dwight Smith of Mission Control Media, and the Executive Director of the California Film Commission, Colleen Bell. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.